Good morning. This is my reminder to turn my cell phone off and my invitation for us to greet each other. So for the introverts among us, gird yourselves, steel yourselves. Extroverts, enjoy. And invite us to greet the people around us meaningfully and to work together to make sure everyone gets greeted and gets greeted in the way they want. So watch for the cues. I invite us to say hello to one another. When I was in grade school and the family still had a television, my parents didn't like television, so we didn't have it for most of my growing up. But when I was young and we did have it, I remember feeling very frustrated when our favorite TV shows were interrupted by either technical difficulties or more often breaking news of the Vietnam War, including the protests being held in response. Oh, and then, oh my goodness, Watergate. Oh, always interrupting. It was such an inconvenience to my younger self when the Waltons was interrupted by boring news. The idea of interrupting our regularly scheduled programming is very much related to renewal, figuring out what in our usual programming needs interrupting, in fact. And I will start to get to the personal version of that a little bit later, but first, here in sermon number 1, I want to draw on the idea of interruption to offer at long last a little bit of spiritual, ethical, moral grounding for facing and approaching the violence and human suffering in Palestine and Israel. Some of you have shared with me how much your heart aches at the suffering of the people first of Israel after the October 7 attack, and then increasingly at the suffering of the people of Gaza and Palestine. A number of you have shared with me how immobilized you have felt, caught in the enormity of the suffering, caught in the extent of the violence, caught in the complexity of the politics and history and the limits of your knowledge, caught in your desire, your hope beyond hope for everyone's well-being, and caught, some of you, between the deep feelings of your Jewish friends and neighbors and your Muslim friends and neighbors in what seems an impossibly tangled set of realities. To help us live our personal faith and shared values, faith, I would say, this faith of our tradition, and to begin to find our way through the tangled feelings so we're not immobilized, I offer what I find to be helpful insights from Shadi Mokhtari, a teacher at the School of International Service at American University, where she is assistant professor of peace, human rights, and cultural relations. I'm going to draw on her language very directly this morning, and I hope that having access to these lenses might serve you and all of us, both in the moment and in the weeks and months ahead. I referenced this briefly a couple of Sundays ago. Mokhtari writes that in the pursuit of human rights and the pursuit of justice, there's often a tension between embracing moral clarity versus moral complexity. Moral clarity, she writes, is usually accompanied by the drive to resist, decry, condemn, and denounce injustice, to call out shame and speak truth to power. On the other hand, moral complexity typically involves extending empathy, engaging in dialogue and persuasion, recognizing multiple moral wrongs and truths. Moral clarity denounces injustice. Moral complexity recognizes the layered truths and the humanity of everybody involved. This really is a valuing of the inherent worth and dignity of all, the spiritual goal to which we Unitarian Universalists aspire. Mokhtari writes that it's important not to get so wrapped up in moral complexity that we lose sight of moral clarity, and not to get so caught up and wrapped up in moral clarity that we lose sight of the moral complexity. The spiritual, emotional, and intellectual work at hand is to embrace both moral clarity and moral complexity at the same time, even while they're in deep tension with one another. I found this insight particularly helpful to start untangling my own set of conflicting responses. To help us embrace both clarity and complexity with regard to Israel and Palestine, Mokhtari suggests that we have to start by disentangling several interwoven dynamics. She names 3 important threads to begin. One important thread to find and disentangle from the rest is the tragic history and victimization suffered by Jewish people around the world over many centuries. Hamas's violent and terribly cruel massacre in October was tragic not only for the people in Israel and the people there, but for Jewish people all over the world who felt that attack in the context of generations of pain and trauma and anti-Semitism. This is what our Jewish friends and neighbors and a number of you with Jewish backgrounds have felt and named in various ways. I will add that a commentator pointed out that the students protesting on college campuses are doing exactly what we taught them to do, right? Coming out of the Holocaust, we learned to say, never again, never again. And when they see something that speaks to them of that, they're saying, wait a minute, you told us never again, right? This is that honoring that thread of that larger piece. A second important thread to separate out from the tangle is the political state action of the Israeli government, of course. When Mokhtari was studying protest movements in Iran, she was particularly studying the women's movements in Iran. She noted that the Iranian government was co-opting Muslim suffering and Islamophobia to justify its violence, right? Saying, look at the Islamophobia, and it's using that to justify its violence against what it labeled imperialist states. State victim branding, she called it. She says that in a parallel way, the Israeli government is co-opting the genuine victimization of the Jewish people, victimization that is both from the past and still now, to justify its political, its state actions, its occupation and its long-standing violence against Palestinians. Like all state victim branding, she says, this disguises what is really a deeply and political power-laden dynamic. In this case, by reducing the violence against the state to anti-Semitism alone, as if the violence against Israel is all and only about anti-Semitism, as if it's only about religious or cultural differences as opposed to the political dynamics. Hamas does this too, as does the United States. Teasing out this second thread to see a religion, a culture, and a people distinct from the powers, the political state that is identified with them, is more emotionally challenging than it first appears. It makes logical sense. It's harder in terms of emotional sense. Which brings us to the third thread to find and disentangle, according to Mokhtari. The paradox that decrying human rights violations and atrocities sheds light on human suffering and it humanizes the victims, right? A good thing. But tends to, at the same time, even when unintended, dehumanize the populations associated with the perpetrators, whether the population supports the perpetrators or not, often to the point that those populations become viewed as subhuman and thus deserving of violence against them and undeserving of human rights protection. And this, you can see, tends to run in both directions. The tendency to associate all Palestinians with Hamas, for example, all Muslim people with the attacks of 9/11, all Jewish people with the action of the Israeli government. It's often less a conscious effort than an unintended emotional byproduct of shedding light on suffering and humanizing victims. In our psyches, it presses us toward this either-or dynamic, which brings us back to the tension between moral clarity and moral complexity, in which many people have been feeling mired. Mokhtari says that the rule of thumb when trying to figure out how to hold and weigh these two approaches, clarity and complexity, and I'm quoting Mokhtari now, the rule of thumb is that the more powerful the actor, the more appropriate it is to call on moral clarity, to resist, denounce, condemn. The more powerful the actor, the more appropriate it is to call on moral clarity and take uncompromising moral stances in that case. If it's clear especially that calling in approaches like dialogue and persuasion and connection building are not working. These methods of moral clarity, she says, should be used to confront state power and powerful states. In this case, Israel, United States participation. However, when it comes to people, confronting injustice should be weighted more heavily toward moral complexity. One capable of recognizing and extending empathy to the suffering of the other, even if there isn't a moral equivalency in the present moment. Can we extend empathy even still when it comes to people weighted toward moral complexity? Moral clarity directed to state power and powerful states, moral complexity directed toward the people, all the people. The point, Mokhtari writes, is to leave room for reclaiming the humanity of people on all sides, to leave room for reclaiming the humanity of people on all sides, while demanding accountability for those who are wielding power abusively. Which means taking action toward both, taking action toward clarity, taking action toward complexity. Once again, a both and rather than an either or. My perennial sermon topic. Both and rather than either or. But not exactly all the same either, right? It's this weighing of all of this. This congregation's delegates to General Assembly in a couple weeks will be asked to vote on whether to adopt an action of immediate witness with regard to Palestine and Israel. An action of immediate witness is a statement by UUs in general, so several thousand of whom will vote on whether we should take a very particular stance. I'll be in Michigan after this coming midweek for a few weeks, and so we'll participate by Zoom, but I will invite us next weekend or so into a conversation both about these ideas of Mokhtari and then also about the action of immediate witness. We may or may not arrive at any shared position, but the conversation will inform your delegates as to what's in your mind and in what's in your heart. So as something comes to a vote, they'll be able to hold that. And beyond that, my hope is that this gets us started in earnest on becoming, over the next several months, a resource not only for each other, but also for members of the wider community who are feeling stuck or at impossible odds. Around Israel and Palestine, yes, but also around other polarized and intractably divisive issues. There are so many human-driven challenges in motion right now that call us to embrace both moral clarity and moral complexity at the same time, difficult as it may be. Untangling whatever threads we can as we go. So may we be.